tonight event of the Peace in Jerusalem and the Holy Land Study Group. It has been a month since last time we were here. I just want to welcome everybody one more time. And for the new people who may not know me, I'm one of the members of the committee, the steering committee. I would like to ask our steering committee to stand up so we know everybody who's in the steering committee. We have Suzanne right there. Mari.
I don't participate as much.
Brother Yahya, Aileen, and Harry. And we're missing the chairwoman, the chairperson, Ms. Lamise Denton. Who else? That's it, right?
That's it.
Usually we read a little statement before every meeting about the mission of our group or the statement of the group. And I would like to go over it briefly so I don't take more of your time. In 2008, the Long Beach Interfaith Committee embarked on a lecture series at the Long Beach Public Library to educate the public on the conflict in the Holy Land and Jerusalem from the point of view of each of the three Abrahamic faiths historically resident in the region. Our mission statement is to study the history of Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the perspective of Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and how that history presents us with the current problem. Also to appreciate the religious significance of the Holy Land, and to explore and propose how peace with justice might become possible in the Holy Land. We have rules that apply, as everybody knows. If our speaker presents his speech and his comments, there will be only 2 minutes of each person to raise and ask a question, and everybody else has to be allowed to answer or question after the rest of us have asked the question, which is very brief introduction of the rules. Today, I'm pleased to have Mr. Yehia Ghanem, our speaker. I'm honored to have him here today. He's a well-known Egyptian reporter and correspondent of an editor chief of the most respected newspaper in Egypt called Al-Ihram. He has been a journalist and correspondent in many countries overseas in Europe, in Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Yemen, Afghanistan, and he has won many awards in coverage of those war events. He has been a panelist also in many national and regional international seminars and workshops and conferences. I would like to welcome you, Mr. Ghanem, to our group today, and please come and help us in presenting the experience that you have in the Middle East, especially that affect our mission group basically, and the study of the peace in Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and how can that impact on us based on your experience overseas and worldwide. Please come and join me here. Don't prepare. Just before I guess we start, there would be your presentation, and we will be taking also questions from the group that relates to the topics, if you wish to answer them or give your opinion. In the meantime, we'll have a break after for all the students that came from Long Island, and we can also rejoin them after the question and answer session to continue.
First of all, I would like to say that I'm really happy to be here, and thank you, Imad, for inviting me. So of course, I would have liked to speak in Arabic. Doesn't feel that comfortable speaking in English. But anyway, I will try. Well, when Imad talked to me about this event and told me about the statement of mission of the committee, I was sort of confused where to start from. Well, first of all, it's I'm proud of being Middle Eastern. Of course, I'm proud of being Middle Eastern. I'm proud of belonging to that part of the world, which, although it has been witnessing so many misfortunes throughout the history, it's not that easy to talk about the issue of Jerusalem and Palestine. But what drove what got my attention actually is that the Holy Lands, when you say the Holy Lands, what do you mean by the Holy Lands?
The Jerusalem and the three Abrahamic faith people living in an area that we refer to as the Holy Land, where we have the churches, the mosques, and the
well, it occurred to me when I heard that word that I knew that you were referring to Palestine, mainly Palestine, but in my estimation, the Holy Lands actually is a title that covers the whole area, almost the whole area. Damascus is, by the way, in terms of religion, in terms of prophets who lived in Syria, who even visited Syria. Syria, in that sense, is a holy land. Egypt is also a holy land. Let's not just forget that most, actually not most, all of the prophets, they visited Egypt, and some of them lived in Egypt and died in Egypt and still buried in Egypt. They are still buried in Egypt. So when we say Holy Lands, for me, when I hear that term, my mind doesn't only go to Palestine, it goes to almost the whole area. And maybe that's why I decided to pick up a departure point in talking about this issue from one of the Holy Lands as an example of coexistence that once was there. Egypt, my country, Egypt as a holy land. By the way, for some of the people who do not know, all the prophets lived in Egypt, visited, lived in Egypt. Some of them died and were buried in Egypt, like Joseph. Some of them were born actually in Egypt, like Moses, and spent most of his time over there. The only prophet that never actually visited Egypt, amazingly, was Prophet Muhammad, our prophet as Muslims. But all of them, they were in Egypt. So that example, the Egyptian example of coexistence and tolerance that once was there, that I want to talk about is the coexistence between Jews and Egyptians, both Muslims and purpose in Egyptian history. Egypt has been always a refuge to Jews throughout time. The first massive immigration by Jews to Egypt took place at the time of Prophet Joseph, who was joined later on by his father, Prophet Jacob, and of course his sons. And from that time on, the Jews lived in Egypt for around almost 700 years. And then came Moses. Fortunately, because of political, I would say, political circumstances, the terror that was ruling Egypt at the time, that issue was raised between the Jews and the not the Egyptians. I wouldn't say Egyptians, but the Pharaoh who ruled Egypt at the time, who was very much afraid. He had deep concerns about the faith, the old faith of the Egyptians from the Judaism that was preached by Moses, and that's when the Exodus took place. But nevertheless, you know, in spite of that Exodus, and the Jews took a flight to eastward to Palestine, it never meant that there was no Jewish existence in Egypt after the time of Moses. The Jewish presence in Egypt continued even after the Exodus. And actually the descendants of Joseph, they came to be known in history of Judaism as Saduqiyim, the Tzaddiks sect. They were the direct descendants of Joseph, and some of them are still living in Egypt until now. The coexistence between Jews and Egyptians, as Egyptians are part of the Arab nation, have been always a brilliant example of tolerance. And since the majority of the Egyptians are Muslims and Christians, that means that the majority have been actually tolerant to the minority, in this case, Jews. I'm going to give you some facts and numbers about that brilliant example that once existed in Egypt. And I'm not going to be talking about the time of the prophets. I'm going to be talking from the year 1900 until 1948. In 48 years, 234 licenses were given to the Egyptian Jews to publish their own newspapers. At that time, the only media that was known in the world, that were known in the world, were the print journalism. So when we know that 234 licenses were given and issued by the Interior Ministry, because at that time, there was a special department who was in the Interior Ministry, which was in charge of giving licenses for newspapers. I'm talking about a big number. That's a big number for newspapers for a Jewish community that, you know, went around 65,000. 65,000, 234 newspapers. That's quite a number. But that's not the only thing. most of these newspapers actually, they were, I'm going to give you an example with some of the names. One of the most popular newspapers at the time that were issued by the Egyptian Jews, the name was Eretz Israel, which is land of Israel. I'm talking about a newspaper that was published in Egypt, and the name was the Land of Israel. Would that ring a bell? Would that give you an idea about how much tolerance we had in Egypt towards Jews? We're talking about the time, at that time, the Jews were badly persecuted in Europe. Another newspaper which was very popular, the name was Kadima. Kadima in Hebrew means forward. And ironically, when Ariel Sharon decided to break away from the Likud party and established a new political party, he decided to name it after that very famous newspaper, Egyptian Jewish newspaper, Kadima. So many newspapers like Ben Zion, some other Jewish French newspaper, the Zionisme pour l'Égypte, Zionism for Egypt. We're not just talking about Jewish newspapers, we're talking about Zionist newspapers. Another fact, the main legal advisor of the legendary leader, Egyptian leader Saad Zaghloul, who led the movement for liberating Egypt from the English occupation, just happened to be the head of the Egyptian Zionist movement. And he was advising our leader on how best to negotiate with the English to free Egypt from the English occupation. Does that mean anything? I guess it does. Sure. But the focal point here is that, and that is a fact that is unknown to most of the people. And actually, I had a chance to travel to Israel several times in the course of my work. And I talked to many Israelis, and some of them are prominent politicians. And when I mentioned this thing, that they were surprised. And the strongest stronghold of Zionism during the 19th century was London, and then came New York. And then from the 20s, just about the 20s of this 20th century, that stronghold moved to New York. So New York came on top of the strongholds of the Zionist movement. And London came second. But at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century and onward, until the beginning of the 40s of the 20th century, Cairo was the third strongest hold, the most stronghold and staunch stronghold of the Zionist movement was Cairo. Until I lived in Cairo, I always visited the headquarters of the Egyptian Zionist movement, which is located downtown Cairo. Does that mean anything? I guess it does. Throughout the 20th century, even the 19th century, we had some of the most distinguished cabinet ministers who just happened to be Jews. One of the most famous Jewish ministers who was there in different cabinets and different governments. His name was Yusuf Basha. Basha, it's a title. It's a title that we had from the Ottoman Empire. I don't know what's the translation for it, but it's something distinguished.
Sir, I'd say sir.
Yeah, like Lord.
Lord.
Yeah, and that title was given by the king. So Yusuf Qaradawi, he was the head of the Jewish community in Egypt, and he was one of the most famous ministers of economy in Egypt. Very influential person. His son, Rene Pasha Qaradawi, he had a French name, right? But he was very much Egyptian. He took over after his father passed away, and he became one of the most distinguished prime ministers for Egypt. I would call that a intolerant society where the majority accept and tolerate prime ministers coming from the minority, or actually the minority of the minorities. Ruth Kliger, she was one of the most infamous agents working for the Jewish agency, which was, before the establishment of the State of Israel, was in charge of encouraging, actually not encouraging, but intimidating the Jewish communities in the Arab countries, and to push them to move to Palestine in order to change the demography of the population in Palestine. Ruth Kliger, she was infamous even in terms of many Jewish personalities that I met. She used to work in Arab countries covertly, and she used to stage explosions, plant bombs, and Jewish temples in order to blame the Arabs for such terrorist attacks. Well, the whole point was to terrorize and to intimidate the Jewish communities in order to encourage them to move to Palestine. I remember talking to one of the grandsons of Qaradawi, that famous Egyptian Jewish politician in Paris some years ago, and he told me about the story of his father meeting with Ruth Kliger, and she infiltrated the country, and she wanted to meet his grandfather in order to organize, secret work in Egypt. And Rene Qaradawi, when he realized the real identity of Ruth Kliger, he gave her 48 hours to leave the country, otherwise he's going to report her to the authorities. And he said, "We're Egyptians, we don't want to move to Palestine, we're doing fine here." The Balfour Declaration came out on 5th of November 1917. Well, in history books, in our history books, we're being told one story, that all the Arab countries, including, of course, Egypt came on top of the Arab countries, were very much anti the declaration, and that from day one we were anti the declaration. This is not I wouldn't say it's not the true story, but this is not the whole story. I was researching a subject many years ago, and accidentally I ran across a very strange thing, which actually led me to a totally different side of the story. A part of the history that was never told either. I believe that it was, at the beginning, it was done wittingly. I will talk about the reasons for blacking out that part of our history. But
just expand on the Balfour Declaration, so
Sure.
most of us,
Sure.
in a few words, if you don't mind.
Well, I'm sure that
For
most
our
of the
students.
attendants, most of the attendants are aware of
Not the
Yeah.
young students, I think the Balfour Declaration hasn't been.
the Balfour Declaration. Came out from the Great Britain's foreign minister at the time. His name was Balfour, Arthur James Balfour. He was not Jewish. He was Christian, Protestant, very much Zionist. I bet that most of you do not know that Zionism was not a creation, a Jewish creation. It was a Christian creation. Actually, Protestants are the ones who introduced that notion of Zionism, and it started in the 18th century. Some of the prominent intellectuals, European Protestant intellectuals and politicians came up with this ideology of Protestants in line of a long lineage of believing in the happy millennium and the happy millennium, and their theology means that to accelerate the comeback of the Jesus Christ to us, to do the good against the evil, and lead everyone to heaven. And in order, according to their theology, in order to accelerate that comeback of Jesus Christ to earth, they had to accelerate the reestablishment of the kingdom of Israel in Palestine. As it was mentioned in the Old Testament and the Torah, was one major difference is that in the Torah, God promised that he will reestablish himself the kingdom of Israel. And he warned Jews of trying to reestablish kingdom of Israel by themselves prematurely. Otherwise, it's going to be something that would make them very upset. Those intellectuals, the Protestants, in order to achieve their dream of the happy millennium and the second comeback of Jesus, they said, what the heck? Let's do it ourselves, and let's have Jesus back. That is how the Zionism came about, and incidentally and ironically, the great majority of Jews, they rejected that ideology of Zionism throughout the 18th century, even the 19th century, and then when the secularism movement started within the Jewish communities in Europe, they started adopting that ideology of Zionism, and that's how it became a Jewish movement rather than a Protestant one. Anyway, let's get back to the Balfour. Balfour was a Zionist, a Protestant Zionist, and he wanted to accelerate this happy millennium thing. So he came out with this declaration in which he promised, on behalf of Great Britain, the Jews all over the world to establish a homeland for them in Palestine. As I said, most of the people, they think that the Arab countries and the Arab peoples, they were very much on time. The declaration says they won. But the other side of the story that nobody knows, nobody told that story before. On November 12th, in the biggest squares in Alexandria, there was a rally, a huge rally, celebrating the Balfour Declaration. And it was a mix of Egyptian Jews, Muslims, and Christians. I know that the great majority of Egyptians, they don't know about this thing. But it was there. And amazingly, it was not just a public celebration, it was an official one. Because the king himself, he sent a representative to make a speech over there on his behalf, welcoming Balfour Declaration. Who knows about these things? What kind of tolerance those people had? What kind of tolerance the Egyptians had at the time? Of course, the interpretation that I found in many newspapers, including Al-Ahram, the newspaper that I worked for, and by the way, that celebration was a front-page story in my newspaper many years ago. And the speech of the representative of the king was there, a front-page story. I guess, and it's something sad that most of the Egyptians would feel ashamed that they once were that tolerant with people who actually persecute their own brethren in Palestine. But that was not the only thing. I mean, in Cairo, a week after that celebration, there was another celebration in Cairo in which also a representative of the king made a speech welcoming. But at the time, the interpretations of the Egyptians were very naive. They thought that the declaration was talking about an Arab-Jewish dominion in Palestine rather than a Unitarian Jewish state. They thought that Great Britain, that talked all the time about values, tolerance, they thought that they were planning to establish a multi-faith and multi-ethnic society and state, not just a Unitarian Jewish state. And that's why we celebrated. We celebrated out of our tolerance and accepted it. Now, I don't want to, waste all the time talking about that example, but I just gave some hints of how we once were. Egypt in that context was just an example, and the biggest example for tolerance, of tolerance. But you can find this example you can find it in many other Arab countries. The biggest Arab country after Egypt who held such a Jewish community was Iraq. How many people know how many Jewish community leaders participated in the struggle of Iraqis against the English occupation? I have at least 20 names of Jewish personalities, Iraqi, who fought that struggle against the English occupation. Salih al-Shammari, one of the most prominent Jewish Iraqis, he was outspoken in that fight and struggle to liberate Iraq. They were all good Iraqis, many of them. But the question is, why such tolerance was always limited to Arab countries, since we're talking about the Holy Lands and Middle East, and more specifically about Palestine? Why was that model of tolerance and accepting the other, why was it limited to Arab countries, where the great majority are Arab, Muslims, Christians? Why why was it limited to that and didn't cover Israel, or what became later on as Israel? Why can't we see such model in Palestine today? Does it have to do with ideological backgrounds? I talked to many Israeli personalities and figures. I mean, figures like strategic thinkers, intellectuals, like politicians, you know, including Shimon Peres, Yitzhak Rabin before he was assassinated, Yitzhak Weizmann, the late president of Israel, and formerly, before that, you know, Minister of Defense in several governments, and the nephew of the famous founder of the country, Weizmann, senior, and they all agreed on one thing, that Jerusalem, specifically Jerusalem, there's no security issue about Jerusalem, and they all agreed that if, in case, they give back East Jerusalem, which actually an Arab city, there's not going to be any security threat to Israel. They all talk about emotional things. And that's really because a lot of people think that you know, Jerusalem has to do with security. No, there's no security issue when it comes to East Jerusalem. It's all emotional, psychological. And I would say that the emotional part of the issue is the easiest part to tackle and the most difficult part to tackle at the same time. The easiest because there's no physical threat. And the most difficult because it has to do with deeply rooted feelings towards the place, geography. But again, let me get back to the easiest part of the issue. If it's only the emotional part of it, how about just, you know, presenting or opening up the city to all faith followers? How about internationalizing the city itself? But again, when I think about it, because I've been there covering many rounds of negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians, and even before that, between the Egyptians and the Israelis, I guess the problem is not about the details as we've been talking 2 days ago. I guess it's the point of departure in this the whole thing. Actually, we picked up the wrong point of departure. We started by discussing the details rather than discussing the principles. And the principles revolve around these questions. Are we all humans or not? We have to answer that question. Are we all humans or not? When we try to weigh humans and geography, which scale actually goes down? Human lives or geography? In our faith, we believe, and actually our prophet said that once he looked upon Kaaba. Kaaba is the holiest shrine for the Muslims. And he told his friends that a human life was for God much more than the holiest shrine. For us, it's the holiest of all. And God would be more pleased to save a human life even at the expense of that holiest shrine. Let it be destroyed for the sake of keeping one human life. So I guess the most important thing is to start with, if we're serious and sincere about sorting out the problem, this issue that seems unsolvable, is to answer these questions. Are we all humans or not? Okay. Are we all equal humans? Or there are equal humans and less equal humans?